الله أجمعين وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم وفيهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. فقد نوينا التعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والإرادة على خير وكل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. Alhamdulillah, in our youth classes we have been discussing the fiqh of everyday life, about the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different aspects of our day-to-day lives and our normal routines that we go through. We talked about last week about social conduct and the rights of others, right? Specifically and most importantly the rights of the parents, right? The rights that the child owes to the parent, but also the rights that the parent owes to the child. And along with that, right, the rights of extended family, right, neighbors and others, right, as well. Today, which seems kind of strange for a youth class per se, we'll be talking about money matters, about work, finances, right, having a halal job and keeping in mind the principles of taqwa when working. Now, being that the age group of this course mostly is 12 to 18. How old are you again? 12. Right. That it doesn't seem to be very good. Doesn't seem to be much of a good idea to talk about things that are particularly adult worries and concerns, right? But most of the worries and concerns adults have is because they didn't know this stuff, they didn't know this content before they chose their jobs, and now they're paying the consequences, and they're striving to kind of uproot what they've already established and rearrange their lives after the fact. Right? So if a person goes into the work field or goes into a college and plans for their future, right, on the basis of taqwa, right, having already studied these things, then they would save themselves much harm, right? They would save themselves from falling into the haram, right, and then later on trying to recover from that, and they would save themselves, right, the headache of, right, the becoming, right, of entering into that worldly life, right? Because, right, part of the seeking of work is partially a spiritual aspect. There are spiritual aspects to it, and it is in itself a worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And most of Western concern, especially in adults, but not only in adults, that, right, the problem, right, becomes that, right, I have to work, right, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a week, or sometimes more, right? And my purpose in life is to worship Allah, right? So the person feels torn between these two things, that which they have to do and that which they're supposed to do. They feel like they're being split in two, right, because of the dichotomy of what they're supposed to be striving for in life. Right? They want to worship Allah, but they have bills, right? And, right, others, right, they'll kind of deride those who are not working by saying, right, or you're just going to sit in the mosque and trust in Allah and they say that Allah is going to provide you. Right? So there's extremes on both sides, right, that a person. But in reality, there is no contradiction. There is no contradiction. That when you go to your work or to your job, right, with these principles in mind, right, and upholding these 10 principles that we're going to talk about, right, then your work becomes just as much of worship as your time in the masjid, as your time in the mosque. Right? However, if a person, right, leaves aside these principles and their heart is only striving for worldly gains without any connection to the divine or connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then they're going to pay the consequences of that spiritually, right? So just before we start, right, I don't know if there's anyone following currently online, but there is one person I can pick on here. Right. Just for a moment while I drink my coffee, I want you to think real deeply what it is, right, what kind of job, or we can make it even more general, right, use the cliche kind of question, where do you see yourself in, say, 10 years? Right, you'll be 22, right, in 10 years. Okay, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And this can go for everybody, even if you're my age, right, 10 years, right, a person should not be in the same place 10 years later. Right, as they say, that man kana yawmuhu ka'amsihi, right, that whoever's today is like their yesterday, then they're in loss. Right, because you should have, right, at least improved in something in one day. So 10 years from now, our brother, which I'm not going to name because maybe you don't want your name on social media, right? Where do you see yourself in 10 years? At a university. Okay. What would your major be? What subject do you want to focus on? Math or science. Okay. So what kind of profession do you want to go into? Something to do with math and science? You like math and science? Good. I like science. I like math, but I'm not good at it. I used to be. Okay. Right, so with that in mind, right, it's important to know that, right? So, like for instance, if a person from a very young age, right, as a Muslim, they have certain goals in mind, right? Then they should know how to pursue those goals in the way that is most pleasing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which will bring them the best fruits of this life and the next. Right? They'll have the most success in this life as well, because the blessing that is obtained through the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could never be obtained through his disobedience. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, لا تستبطئوا لا يحملنكم استبطاؤكم على الرزق معصية الله, أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. He said, do not let your seeing your wealth being delayed cause you to disobey Allah. Right? He says, وَأَجْمِلُوا فِي الطَّلَبِ, and be beautiful in the way that you seek the means. Right? فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَنَالُ مَا عِنْدَهُ بِمَعْصِيَتِهِ, because that which Allah has can never be attained through his disobedience. Right? So you might get the paper, you might get the money, you might get the check, but with zero blessing in it. Right? It doesn't go very far. There's always this fear of poverty. There's always this stress and worry of, right, where my next check is going to come from, or this constant fear. Right? And also on top of that, right, the complete lack of gratitude for that wealth, right, which leads to, right, a discontentment and a constant yearning for more and more and more. Right? You have a really nice car, good health, nice house, right, good family, everything, but it's not enough because the neighbor has a nicer car, right, and they have a bigger family and they have a bigger house. Right? So a person, even though they are in comparison to many people in the world in a type of paradise, right, in their comforts of their home, they feel like they're in hell because the neighbor has a better paradise. Right? And that many people live that reality every day, that they have so much, but because they constantly look at what other people have, right, they are blinded by the blessings that Allah gave them. But if they were to have sought that provision, right, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and through his obedience, they would not only have gotten the same exact wealth, which has been promised since before we were created, right, but they would also have the blessing that comes with it, the spiritual, right, the spiritual upbringing, right, the spiritual depth that comes with that blessing, right? And on top of that, they'll have that contentment, right, that won't lead them to a fear of poverty or complaining, right? And it's really a shame that many of the people who committed suicide, right, in the past 10 years, many of them were millionaires. Some of them multi-millionaires, right? Some of them, right, reaching very closely to billionaire status, and they killed themselves, right? If you were to tell a 6th century, a 14th century Arab in the middle of the desert that a person would have, right, literally the wealth of an entire country, right, and still be so sad and so depressed that they would kill themselves, they wouldn't believe you. They would not believe you, because Arabs were content. They are content with less, right, and they are happy, right? I mean, like the Bedouin, the ancients, the people of the past, right? Even people till today who follow that same suit, right? I've been in people's houses who don't have, right, any of the average customary comforts that we have. They don't have carpeted floors. They don't have even painted walls. The walls are mud, right? They have one spinning fan on the ceiling, and that's pretty much the extent of their luxury. Right? But they are the happiest people on the whole entire planet, and the most charitable. You would think that the person who has millions would be the one with the hands stretched out the most, right? Giving people and helping people and feeding people, but it's not the same, right? So money itself is very deceiving, right? It looks like it's a source of happiness, right, but it has nothing to do with happiness, right? It is what it is. It's just paper, or it's just a material, or it's just a metal, or it's just a number, right? Sometimes we don't even touch anything. It's just a number in an account somewhere, right? But that number can be coupled with, right, blessings and the pleasure of Allah and eternal success in this life and in the next, or it could be coupled with absolute, right, discontentment, sadness, depression, right, an insatiable desire for more. So it depends on the method, right, how we seek it and how we perceive that, right? So all of it goes back to the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we've been covering through this course, right? So the limits of Allah, right, being the realm, right, within the limits of Allah is the realm that the believer lives in, right? These are the limits of Allah, right? And whoever transgresses the limits of Allah, then they are the losers. And that applies in this world and the next. Right? Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَن يُطِعِ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ يُدْخِلْهُ جَنَّاتٍ. Right? Whoever obeys Allah and His Messenger, He will enter them into paradises that go on forever. Right? And that is the ultimate success. Right? So, but the reason why there's these limits is really important to keep in mind, right? Because, right, this life being a test, right, you can't have a test, right, unless you have the possibility of wrong answers. Otherwise, it would just be, right, imagine if you had a test, right? What is 2 plus 2? It's a multiple choice test, right? But there's only one choice. The answer, right? 2 plus 2, right? First choice. Choice A, 4. There's no other B. There's no B, there's no C, there's no D. Is that really a test? Or it's just an exercise in handwriting? Right? That's pretty much all it is, right? But the fact that there is the possibility of choosing wrong, or choosing that which is disobedience to Allah, or choosing that which looks good, but you know it's wrong, right? That's where the test is, right? So the one who passes it, that's the one who has true Islam. The one who really says that Allah knows better what's best for me, I choose that. Right? That's submission. Right? Right? And it's an expression of love. Right? And by means of constantly being given that choice, every single day we're given that choice, right? To do something that is disobedient to Allah, or to do something that's obedient to Allah. Right? To choose the path of wrong or the path of good. Right? Every single day we have hundreds and hundreds of opportunities to choose. So every time we are presented with that choice, it's another chance to come closer to Allah. Right? If by making the right choice. Right? So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, طلب الحلال فريضة بعد الفرائض. That seeking halal, seeking lawful provision, right, money or whatever, right? Seeking lawful provision is obligatory, right, after the other obligations. Right, so right, prayer comes first, right? Belief comes first, fasting Ramadan comes first, obligations come first. Right? After that, it is obligatory to seek lawful means. Right? And the Prophet ﷺ said, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ إِثْمًا أَنْ يُضَيَّعَ مَنْ يَعُولُ. It is sufficient for a person to be a sinner that they neglect those who are dependent on them. Right? So if you have kids, No? But if you had kids, right, and right, they're hungry, but you don't feel like working. Nah, I'm good. I'm just gonna sit here, right? Netflix. Right? I don't want to work. But the kid's crying because he's hungry, right? That is haram. It's haram, right? So it is obligatory to seek the means that is halal, right? In order to, especially if one is responsible for other people. If one is not responsible for anyone, they don't really have to work. They don't have to do anything. Right? Or if a person is on their own, it's just them. Right? They can just not eat, fast. Right? They won't have to work a full-time job. They might have to work just some odd jobs just to get a lunch for one day, but they really don't have to work. But if you're responsible for someone else, then it would be obligatory to seek halal means. Right? So when is work halal? Right? So anyone who's watching this, right, they would have thought to themselves where they want to be in 10 years or what kind of occupation they want to go into. Right? So how do we know whether the occupation that we're looking for or that we're looking to go to is halal or not? There's two questions. If you ask yourself these two questions, right, and you pass, do the job, right, and say Bismillah. And so first, the work itself, the actual tasks and duties that the person does in that job, is that halal? Right, so for instance, what's the ruling of selling drugs? Can you sell drugs? No. It's haram and it's illegal. Right, so it's like a double no. Right, so that work in and of itself, even if a person has the greatest intentions of all time, I'm going to sell this drug so I can build an orphanage in Senegal or something, right? It means nothing to Allah. It is haram, right? It will distance a person from haram, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But if the work itself is halal, like for instance, a person is a mathematician and a scientist, right? Right? So the second question arises: does my work directly assist other people in haram? So the work itself is fine. Working on computers, halal. Right? Right? Doing math, halal. Right? There's no verse of the Quran saying, "Oh mankind, oh you who believe, do not do math." Right? No. Right? Doing mathematics and science. This is pretty much like the vastest subjects. You probably could find millions of halal jobs in those two subjects, right, as opposed to other types of work, like the entertainment industry. Right? You're going to have a lot less halal choices than you would if you're going for math and science or medicine and these things. Right? But You get hired at a company. Your job, you make equations and algorithms, and you program systems, and you do scientific things. But what are you doing it for? So that they can make nuclear bombs and blow up people. So now what's the ruling? Right. It's haram. Right? You can't directly assist them in haram. Now, if your assistance is indirect, right, then it's not haram. If it's indirect, like if you're literally designing the bomb, right, making the equations and doing the scientific, right, work behind it, right, that's haram. Right? Even though, right, the math and the science itself is not. Right? But it's directly assisting. Right? If it's indirect assistance, then that has a different ruling, right, entirely. Right? And we'll talk about this in a bit later. Right? But most occupations, especially in developed countries, are permissible. Almost, right, majority are permissible, and to the extent that one lives in a country that there are so many halal options, to that extent, then there will be no excuse whatsoever to seek haram options. Like you can become, right, an engineer at any company, but you chose the company that builds bombs. Right? That's your fault. Right? It's not. Right? There's no one to blame except for one's own self. But for instance, say you're a farmer, right, and you grow grapes. Right? Is growing grapes halal? Yes, right. But what if, right, and somebody comes and they buy grapes from you? They say, I want 100 kilos of your green grapes. Right? Is that halal to sell them 100 kilos of green grapes? Yeah. What if they, right, without you knowing, they go somewhere else, they take your green grapes and they turn it into wine? Is that your fault? No. Right, so that's an indirect assistance. You didn't say, here's grapes, hope your wine tastes good. Right? No, you're not helping them directly. Right? So that would be something that's not in your capacity. If you're reasonably sure that there's a possibility that they would use it for something haram, then you have, right, the recommendation of not selling it to them, right? But it's not obligatory and it's not haram to sell it to them because it's not direct assistance, right? Another kind of red flag to watch out for in the work field, in the business sector, when one goes into, right, moves on to a job or, right, to making money or earning an income, is interest, right, riba. And it used to be called usury, which, right, it's kind of like, it has a bad connotation, and that's what it's supposed to have, a bad meaning. Right? Interest, it's in your best interest. Right? It sounds good. Right? It's not good. Right? And interest is one of the largest reasons why there is so much poverty in the world. Right? So for instance, if we just give you just an example, just to put the picture out there, right? Say you have, right, 50-50. You have people who have less than a certain amount of money, say like the nisab, right? The nisab is a catable amount of money. So you say you have 10 people. 5 of them have less than $1,000, right? And 5 of them have more than $5,000. Okay. Now, the 5 poor people, let's say the poor and the rich, the 5 poor people, they don't have enough money to take care of their needs. So what do? They borrow it from the rich people. Right? But, right, so poor people, they borrow $5,000 from the rich people. Right? But in order to pay that $5,000 back, they have to pay on top of that another $5,000 in interest. Right? So they have to pay back the $5,000, the original $5,000, and another $5,000 in interest. So what happens then? That means now the rich people went from having $5,000 to now having $15,000 or $10,000, and the poor people went from having, right, 2,000 to now negative, right? What is it? It's negative. A lot of negatives, right? A lot of negative money. It's way too early for math, right? So the poor become poorer and the rich become richer, and it never ends. It never ends, right? And then once the poor are poor, right, and especially if they're in debts, they have no say in anything, right? They have no say in the politics of the world. They have no say in the democratic system, right? Because they don't have enough money to voice their opinion. Whereas the ones who have all the money, right, they're the ones that can pay for presidential campaigns and this and that, right? So it becomes lopsided completely, all because of interest. Right? And interest has been prohibited throughout by all the prophets. Right? Isa alayhi salam, he's recorded in the biblical tradition that he actually went into the temple and he flipped over the tables, and he scolded them for doing interest, for using usury in the masjid, or in the sacred place. They were doing it in the place. Right? And Allah says in the Quran that they made this kind of interpretation because Musa, he prohibited usury, Riba. He prohibited it completely. Right? But later on, right, his people, they said, you know what Musa really meant? He meant that us Jews can't do interest with other Jews, but we can take interest from non-Jews. Right? And Allah says in the Quran, وَمِنْهُمْ يَقُولُ لَيْسَ عَلَيْنَا فِي الْأُمِّيِّينَ سَبِيلٌ وَيُقِرُّونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ وَهُمْ يَعْلَمُونَ. They say that, right, we're not accountable for the Gentiles, for the non-Jews, right? And Allah says that they say a lie about Allah knowingly. They knowingly say a lie about Allah. Right? So it's always been prohibited. Right? So the Prophet, he made a very emphatic prohibition. Right? He included, right, in the prohibition the one who gives interest, the one who takes interest, the one who signs the contract that has to do with interest. Right? So any association, or any direct association with interest, right, has the same ruling as taking interest. Right? It's haram. It's a major sin in Islam, and there's only 2 times where Allah declares war on someone, right, between the Quran and the Hadith, right, and one of them is for interest. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. O you who believe, right, leave that which remains of usury if you are true believers. فَإِن لَمْ تَفْعَلُوا, and if you do not do, فَأْذَنُوا بِحَرْبٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, then an announcement of war is made to you from Allah and His Messenger. Right? That's intense. Right? The other one is to treat one of the saints of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with enmity. Right? To treat one of the friends of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala badly. So there's a lot on the website, right? But either dealing in interest or direct association with interest is haram. One of the biggest, right, it's a major sin and one of the biggest sins of Islam. Indirect assistance, right, is disliked. So for instance, our technician, our computer savvy, right, friend here, okay, he's a computer genius, so he gets hired, right, to fix all of the computer systems in a bank. Right. So his working in the bank, is he directly helping them, right, do their interest? No. He's not writing contracts, he's not advertising, he's not selling, he's not buying, he's not dealing in interest, but he's assisting that company indirectly, because had it not been for his skills, they would not have been able to do it so easily. Right? So, but that would be disliked, not haram, because he's not directly assisting. Okay, but if a person is directly assisting, like a stockbroker or something, selling you teaching you about compound interest in stocks and these things, then that's direct. Another thing which is very close to interest and has the same prohibition as interest, right, they call the sister of riba, which is gharar. Gharar in Arabic, gharr yaghirru, means to deceive someone. Right, so gharar is deceptive uncertainty, that you pay for something but you don't really know what you're getting in return. It sounds weird, right? Why would somebody do that? You give me money, right, and I'll give you some abstract, right, thing in return. Sounds weird, right? Right. But many of the conventional modes of interest are like that. Insurance are like this. Conventional modes of insurance are like this. Like, for instance, life insurance. You pay them, say, $500 a month, right? And when you die, they're going to, right, give you a whole bunch of money. Well, not you, because, right? So what are you actually paying for? You can't really put your finger on it. Like, if you were to write the contract, like that, like, on this day I'm going to die, so you're going to have to pay this much, right? You don't know how you're going to die. You don't know how much the funeral cost is. You don't know what the medical bills will be. You don't know any of those things. So you don't really know what you're getting in return, right? Same thing, car insurance, right? Right? If you get in an accident, we'll take care of you. What kind of transaction is that, right? What happened to, I'll sell you this cup for $10. Okay, here's the cup, here's $10. That's pretty straightforward, right? But you give us a whole bunch of money every month, right, continuously, right? And just if someone hits you, we'll take care of it, right? What are you really buying, right? It's deceptive. You have no idea what you're buying, right? So conventional modes of insurance are impermissible. They are haram, right? However, due to some laws in some countries, right, making it mandatory to have, right, car insurance or things like that, right, because of the harm or the difficulty it would be on the Muslims, right, to not take car insurance and therefore not be able to drive at all, right, then it's allowed. It's allowed only because of that difficulty, right? So I believe in the States, from my recollection, right, it is illegal to drive without car insurance. And if your car is uninsured, you cannot drive. It's illegal. Because you may hit someone else, and then who's going to pay for it? You? You don't have. You run into somebody's brand new Mercedes, right? And you're on your way to McDonald's, right, just to get some French fries because you can't afford groceries. You're going to pay for their Mercedes now, right? No. Right. So they made a law. You can't drive without insurance. Right? So what are the Muslims supposed to do? Right? Insurance is deceptive uncertainty. Right? Its main ruling is that it's impermissible. But because it's impossible for any Muslim to drive if they were to follow that opinion, right, which would cause extreme amounts of difficulty, then it's allowed. Right? And the scholars allowed it only because of that difficulty. Right? But if there is no difficulty, right, and there's no law, right, imposing it, like life insurance, these things, then we leave it. Right? We leave it. Right? For some people, something may be difficult if they didn't have it, and some people, somebody has a chronic medical issue, and they don't live in, right, Canada Sharif, right, and say they live in the States, and they have a constant medical issue, right, they would be bankrupt from all those bills. Right? So for them, it may be a necessity to have health insurance. Right? So the exceptions are to avoid either manifest or likely harm. Right? There will be harm in not taking it. Islam has always had an alternative to insurance called takaful. It's called, or you can call it cooperative insurance, where everybody puts their money together. Right? It's kind of like a pool. You just pool your money together, Right? Everybody adds something to it, and then if something happens to you, you can take from your money, and you can take from what you put in there. Right? So it's kind of like a savings account, or you just put it to a side. If something happens, then it's your money. You can do as you wish. Right? And it's important to note these things because one of the primary causes of bankruptcy, right, in America and the U.S. is what? Right, we already talked about interest, so take that off the board. What do you think is the primary cause of bankruptcy in the United States? What do you think? Gambling? I wouldn't doubt that that's definitely up there. I've met some scary gambling addicts in my life. Scary. Very sad thing. I seen a friend of mine, his father gave him a necklace just before he died, a chain before he died, and he gambled that away. And in order to win it back, he gambled his shoes, right? And he lost that also, and then he had to borrow money to get gas to go home, and then we broke down halfway on the way home because we ran out of gas. People can go. Addiction is a reality, but it's not gambling, alhamdulillah. Right? It's medical crisis. Somebody in the family gets a terminal illness, right, and they don't have insurance. That's it. Right? I remember as a child, I went to the hospital, I think for 2 weeks. I was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and even though my father had really good insurance from his job, right, but the hospital accidentally sent the bill to us and not to the insurance company. The bill was $120,000. Do you think any basic middle-class family could afford just to pay one bill for $120,000? No. Right, so sometimes there is a harm if a person doesn't have the interest, but if there is no harm and there's no likely harm, then they should avoid it. But in order to apply any of these things, right, it's impossible to follow any of the limits of Allah without knowledge. It's impossible to be obedient to Allah without knowing what is halal, what is haram, what is allowed, what is not, what is the gray area in between. Right, so without knowledge, there's no such thing as taqwa. There's no such thing as taqwa without knowledge. Right, he says, وَمَنْ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ يَعْمَدُ فَأَعْمَالُهُ مَرْدُودَةٌ لَا تُقْبَلُ. Anyone who acts without knowledge, then their actions are rejected, not accepted. Right? And Sayyidina Umar, he prohibited anybody from doing business in the marketplace of Medina, right, until they learned the rulings. He said that because the person who doesn't know the limits of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, they will fall into usury interest whether they like it or not. They'll just accidentally do it. They didn't even realize. Right? But the second important thing is caution. Right? It's caution. Right? Especially when it comes to money matters. When it comes to matters of money and finances, it's important to have caution. Right? But true caution is to do that which is most likely to be pleasing to Allah. Right? It's not just to, right? If you take 100 Muslims and say, what is ihtiyat? What is caution? Right? I wouldn't be surprised if somebody said, right, to consider everything haram until it's halal, until proven halal. Right? Or someone else to say, to always take the strictest opinion possible, right, in every situation. And some people, that's their reality, that they want to be cautious, right? And they just make life hard for themselves. Right? That's not caution. First, there's no such thing as caution without knowledge. Just guessing because, this is harder, it must be better. Right? No. Right? There's no caution without knowledge, and true caution is to seek that which is most likely to be pleasing to Allah. Right? So if you have a doubtful situation, should I do it or should I not? Right? Consult. ask somebody, ask a person of knowledge. Right? So caution and consultation go hand in hand. Right? Asking somebody. You want to be cautious? Ask. Right? That's the equation. Right? Many people, they want to be cautious, so they guess. Right? And then they end up, right, making haram on themselves, that which was completely halal, right? And sometimes still falling into the haram, right? Because they didn't think it was haram. Right? So this is why this subject is important, even for youth. Right? So just to recap, for those who came, right, that seeking a halal, a lawful means is obligatory. Right? The work is halal when the actual work itself, right, is something permissible, and it does not directly assist in the impermissible. Right? If it directly assists in the impermissible, it's haram. Right? Even if the work itself is halal, we talked about the example of a person who's a scientist. Right? Being a scientist is halal. Right? You're studying the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? But being a scientist that helps people make nuclear bombs is haram. Right? Even though the work itself is halal, right? It's directly assisting in the haram. Right? We talked about interest, right? Taking it, and, giving it, or being party to the contract, right, is haram. And one of the biggest and major sins of Islam, when Allah declares war on that person. Right? Same thing with deceptive uncertainty. Right? Gharar, right? Like most modern conventional insurance follows under that. There's no certainty of what you're buying, right? With the exclusion of that which, right, it would be difficult for a Muslim to live their normal life if they didn't have it, like car insurance. Here it would be, is it legal to drive without car insurance? No, it's obligatory, right? It's mandatory to drive with car insurance. So either you don't drive at all, which would be very difficult for many people, especially people who don't live, right, near public transportation. Right, so the second principle is what we mentioned a couple times now, just assisting in sin. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَتَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْبِرِّ وَالتَّقْوَى. Assist each other in virtue, right, and taqwa, and mindfulness. وَلَا تَعَاوَنُوا عَلَى الْإِثْمِ وَالْعُدْوَانِ. And do not assist each other and do not help each other in sin and in transgression. And this verse was revealed, right, to the Muslims in their relationship with the Quraysh, with the polytheists, in essence. Right? But it doesn't, it's general. Any assistance, direct assistance in a haram is prohibited. Right? So if the assistance is direct, right, you made the algorithm that produced the bomb, right? That's direct assistance. You did it. Right? That is haram, even though making algorithms is not necessarily something haram itself, right? But it's direct assistance in haram. But indirect assistance is disliked. Right? It's not haram, right? But it is disliked, and we'll talk about, right, that one should seek a job, right, or a livelihood that is even free from this, that's free from even indirect assistance. Right? We gave an example just now, like you are a computer technician or a computer engineer, and you're hired by a bank to upgrade their software. Right? Are you helping them do interest? Are you doing the interest directly? Are you directly involved in assisting them in their taking or giving of interest? No, you're not directly involved, right? But there is some indirect, right, correlation between your work and them being able to do their interest, their usury. So it would be disliked if one has another choice. If one doesn't have another choice, right, then, right, while, right, they can continue in that while they try to look for another job. Shaykh Baraz gave the example of a friend of his that was, right, really down and out financially, in like a financial struggle, right? And he's a carpenter, and he was hired to help build a church. Right? Would you take the job? Right. So if you're really, your family is in desperate need, right, you may have to take that, right? It's indirect assistance. It's not direct. You're not telling them to worship other than Allah. Right? You're not like pushing them, go ahead and make sajda to whoever. Right? You're not doing that. Right? But there is a definite correlation. There is, right, some assistance there, but it's indirect. But in that situation, it would be better than the alternative, which would be, right, to completely neglect the needs of the family. Right, so it's important to know these rulings because some people have circumstances. Like a person, they finally get a job, right? I have a friend who became Muslim in jail, and right, every time he fills out an application, they say, "Are you a convicted felon?" He has to say, "Yeah." And many places will not hire. So if he gets a job at a supermarket, should he take it? Right? He finally gets a job at a supermarket, so he takes the job. Right? Is there haram products in the supermarket? Most definitely. Right? But is his ringing up your items, right, is that directly assisting you in that haram? So you put down your pork hot dogs, right, on the conveyor belts, and right, and Ahmed or whatever his name is takes it and goes deet, right? Is that assistance? It's a type of assistance, but it's completely indirect. You didn't say, you know what, buy these pork hot dogs, right? You didn't say that. Right? You're not the one cutting the pork in the butcher area. You're not the ones, right? So it's indirect, right? And people have circumstances, so it's good to know the difference between the two. But right, one, to the extent that one has the ability, they should seek the most wholesome work. Right? So permissible, we talked about already, it avoids the haram and it avoids direct assistance in the haram. Right? Praiseworthy work, right? It not only avoids the haram and direct assistance, but it itself is good. Right? It causes good. It brings about good in the community, either directly or indirectly. Right? So direct good, right? Building orphanages, right? Feeding the poor, right? Helping the orphans and the widows and the people in the community that have been forgotten. Right? That will be a direct assistance in good. Right? Also, it would avoid something that avoids the haram and even indirect assistance in the sin. So that would be a wholesome job. That's what someone should seek. And most jobs that are out there, especially in developed countries, right, would definitely be, as a majority, free from any involvement in sin or assistance in sin. Almost majority of jobs, you would be hard pressed to find. Right, there would be a small list of jobs that would be direct assistance in the sin or sinful themselves. Especially like in the medical field or science or right, in math, technology, these things. Right, majority of that would not entail any direct assistance in haram. Right, but right, so the fact that there's so many options, it would be even worse for someone to choose something, right, just because it's cool or because I have the chance to raise in the ranks of my company. Right? You raise in the ranks in the eyes of the people, but you fall in the ranks in the eyes of Allah. Right? What's more important? Right? So it's recommended to seek out praiseworthy work. Right? Something that promotes the good. Right? Teaching people, right? Especially like teaching people, even worldly knowledge promotes good. Education promotes good. But teaching people religious knowledge, it's a higher good. Right? Something that benefits others. Right, something that helps others prevent harm, that something prevents harm from others. So, right, tamam. Now, interestingly, many of what we would call today Muslim countries, meaning outside of the Middle East, outside of the Arabian countries, many of them, if not, one could argue almost most of them, became Muslim or Muslim majorities because of work, because of business and trade. right? And historically, it's an amazing thing and we see this even in the lives of the Sahaba, that they weren't necessarily, that every single Sahaba was necessarily a preacher, that they would go and say, right, that Muslims believe this, and this, and your beliefs are wrong because of this, and this, and debating people and, right, quoting Bible verses at them, and right, you don't find that amongst the Sahaba. Right? But what you did find is that they lived the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and they upheld his character. Specifically, a group of traders from Hadramaut, from southern Yemen, where alhamdulillah we were blessed to study, many centuries ago, they traveled by boats to a place called Sumatra. Sumatra is now it's a series of 50 or so islands that make up Indonesia. Right. So they traveled to Indonesia, and they set up their purpose for travel. Right, obviously, they had high purposes, but their purpose generally was business. They went there for trade. They weren't preachers. They weren't really scholars. They knew their religion. They practiced it well, but they weren't particularly preaching. So they went and they established their businesses. Right? But they did it with such excellence, right? Keeping and upholding the etiquettes of the prophets, the character of the prophet, right? Giving people discounts when they knew that they didn't have enough money, right? Forgiving people for their debts when they knew that they couldn't pay. These are all the sunnahs of the prophet. Giving people refunds even though they didn't have to. Right? The prophet said that man aqala atharat Muslim aqala Allahu atharatahu yawm al-qiyamah, or kama qala. He said that whoever refunds a Muslim for a purchase that they made regretfully, right, Allah will refund their sins on the Day of Judgment, meaning Allah will erase their sins on the Day of Judgment. Right? So they did that, they lived that. Right? And now Indonesia is over 60 million Muslims. 60 million Muslims. And they trace their Islam back to what they call the Wali Songo, right? The 9 saints. The 9 saints. Actually, technically, if you really dig deep enough, it's about 40, but there's 9 particular saints. And amongst them were those who were not even scholars. I mean, scholars in the erudite sense, but they weren't necessarily scholars, nor were they necessarily preachers, but they were amazing people. They upheld their excellent character in their business, and they spread Islam by that. And many of the scholars, they say that the state of the hearts of the Sahaba while they were doing business, right, is greater than the state of most Muslims in the masjid while they're in prostration. They're buying and selling, and their connection with Allah is so much stronger than even a Muslim of today making sajda, because they understood these realities. Right, so they literally changed the world while working. They punch in and day out, and then not only do they get their salary, but they also have 100,000 shahada. 100,000 people became a Muslim just because of one person. Habib Ahmed bin Taha al-Mashhur al-Haddad, 100,000 people, over 100,000 people became Muslim at his hands. Habib Umar bin Sumait of Zanzibar, similar, over thousands and thousands of Muslims at their hands. Not necessarily because they preached. Just some people just looked at their faces and became Muslim. Right? And all of it going back to their deep intention behind their work, right? That they were doing it for Allah. All of it was for Allah. Right? The Prophet said that the truthful, trustworthy businessman will be with the martyrs on the Day of Judgment. It's an interesting hadith. They'll be with the martyrs. In another narration, they will be with the prophets, right? The truthful and the martyrs on the Day of Judgment. Why those two qualities? Truthful, trustworthy businessman or business person. Right? One, because in the marketplace, the nature of the marketplace is that the customer generally trusts what you say. Right? They generally trust what you say. So a trustworthy person would only tell them what's true. Right? Would only Right? So saduq, that they are truthful, that they tell you if there's a fault. They tell you if it's the right product for you or not. Right? They tell you right, the reality of that product, if we're talking about products. Right? But trustworthy, that they won't hide a fault. Technically, if you don't ask, right, in most marketplaces of today, if you don't ask, they won't tell you. They're not going to go out of their way to tell you the faults of this product. The battery doesn't last very long, right? Or whatever, right? They won't go out of their way to tell you the faults, right? But truthful, trustworthy, right? Both of those, many people leave off those two qualities because they can make a quick buck because of it. If all I got to do is not tell them this one thing, and they'll definitely buy this product. Whereas the people of Allah, they would say no, right? They have the best interests of that person in mind. Just to, while we close the topic, the last few topics, working for someone else, right, or doing a service for someone, right, entails a contract. And contracts are extremely important in Islam. Extremely important. Right, so this applies to, right, either a sale, working for someone, or doing a service for someone, right? That the most important thing, that the contract should be clear and have completely clearly defined all of the terms of the contract. Right? All of the terms should be clearly defined without any deception. Right? So that entails, right, what is being sought, right? So what is the product itself? Right? You know how many times, right, that you buy a book online, right, and no description, no picture, right? You think you're getting the right book, but then it comes and it looks like the poor guy swam here from right? There was no clear definition of what the product was. Right? What exactly is the product? What company? What? Right? Generally, pictures and these things can suffice, right? But also work. Right? I'm being hired by so and so. Right? What is my job description? Very important. Right? What is the job description? What do you want from me? What do you want me to do? Right? And especially if a person's being, right, to clarify whether a person is being paid by for the service or for their time. Because a person could, for instance, they can work 30 hours a week, right, and have 100 tasks. Right? So are they being paid for the tasks? Or are they being paid for the time? Because maybe they can't do all 100 tasks in 30 hours. Right? But if they work 30 hours, right, and they're being paid by time, then even if they don't finish a task, they should be paid. So, but services, this applies, right, more directly to services, because services, there's a lot of misinformation and lack of detail in contracts. One great example is painting. Has anyone here ever bought a painter or hired a painter? Don't buy people. Don't buy people. The Prophet said one of the signs of the Day of Judgment, one of the major sins is man ba'a hurran, by someone who sells a free person. Don't buy people. Right? But if you hire a painter, anyone ever hired a painter or a plumber or, right? Yeah. Right, so say I hire C.D. Jacob to paint my house, right? And over the weekend, to paint my house over the weekend. So he brings his whole crew. Right, now the question is, am I paying him for the house to be painted, or am I paying him for his services or his hours during that weekend? Because the problem is, what happens if he paints 3/4 of the house and the weekend's over? Now there's an argument. I paid you to finish the whole house. You paid me to work for the weekend. I worked for the weekend. Now if you want me to continue, pay me more. Right? No, I paid you to do the house. Right? There's right, lack of detail. It leads to arguments. And generally, any contract that leads to arguments is disliked, or it could be sinful, right, to allow oneself to get into that contract. Right, so you should clarify that I am paying you to paint the whole house, right, on your word that you said you could do it in 2 days. If you can't do it in 2 days, you have to continue, right, and finish the task, right, at your own on your own, without any additional pay. So something like that to clarify the terms. Obviously, you can use more legal words, and also the pay, right, the money, how much you're getting. Not mentioning the price causes the contract, or it causes the sale to be sinful and to the same level of sin as interest. Right? And this happens a lot amongst like friends and colleagues and stuff. Like, I'll buy your Apple or your MacBook from you. Like, he's like, okay, here you go. You're like, how much? I'll take care of you. Don't worry, I got your back. You think I'm cheap? I got your back. Right? Don't worry. Right? Haram. Right? It's not permissible. It's not permissible because it leads to fights. Right? They may assume that you're going to give them a higher amount. You're not giving them that much. Right? It leads to arguments. And the basis that contracts and transactions have to be on mutual consent. Both parties have to be happy. إِلَّا عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِنْكُمْ. Also, the duration, we already mentioned about the painter. Okay.
Sometimes when you ask like people you know to do work for you, we don't really discuss the price, but it's okay, I'll fix whatever you want fixed. And then once the work is done, they always say, just give me whatever you want. And that kind of leaves you in that situation where you don't know like what the going rate is, but if you give them less than what they expect, or more, and it's like very confusing.
It's very problematic.
They just say whatever, give me whatever you want.
This really just irked me, and it just bothered me every time I got into a taxi in a Middle Eastern country, right? Excluding like other, right? In Yemen specifically, right? الذي معك, whatever you got, whatever you can give. And then you give something, you can tell they're obviously upset. Like, why'd you even say that? Like, and you have to almost fight with them to say, like, no, how much? Right? And then after that, you can give them more if you wish, but that's, right, it's problematic, right? Especially when it becomes like a cultural norm. So, right, detailed, and for somebody to feel offended by wanting specifics, that's not really on you. That's not your responsibility. Right? Well, what do you mean, how much? Or what do you mean, you don't trust me? You don't, right? Like, all of these are just false claims. Like, and they're kind of, right, worrying either, also. Right? Like, why are you being so defensive? Like, you have something to hide? Right? And generally, any contract that has, right, some consequence to it should be written down. Right? Verbal contracts are valid, but it should be written down in the case of, right, disagreement. That, for instance, the person said, "No, I thought we agreed on this." Right? Maybe not even with ill intent, but generally just because, right, someone might have forgot or misunderstood. Right? To have it written down so you can say, "No, this is what we agreed on. We both signed it." You can show it to them, and this, especially with loans, right? Especially with loans, and especially loans amongst family members. Okay? And there's a saying that "عامل الناس كالأجانب وعاشروهم كالأحباء," that socially deal with people like strangers, like especially business transactions, loans, money, these things, right? But live amongst them like loved ones, like family. So you're nice to people, you live with them like as if they're your close, right, loved ones, right? But when it comes to these types of matters, be specific, right? Write them down, right? Just because he's your cousin doesn't mean that, right? Everyone has nafs, right? Especially loans, and the obligation to write down loans is an obligation the command to write down loans is a command of recommendation in the Quran, right? إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه. If you agree upon a debt to a certain period of time, right, then write it down. And that's the longest verse in the Quran. It's one whole page, the verse on debts. Tamam. Second, is this a level down from contracts, because contracts are legally binding, right? But promises are not contracts. Right? Promises are not contracts, but they are a trust. It's an amana. Right? It is a trust, and it is prohibited to make promises unless one can meet two conditions. And this applies to business and finance, but also to other things. It is prohibited to say, I will do this, right, unless one has these two conditions met. One is that they have an actual firm intention to do it. Like, I will be at your party, but in the back of their head, nah, I probably won't go. Right, that's not permissible. Right, it's not allowed, because that's lying, essentially. Right. The second is that one is reasonably sure of the ability to fulfill that promise. Right. I will be there at your wedding, right? And they really mean it. They want to be there, but they live in, right, Alberta, right, and the wedding is in 4 hours. Could you get from Alberta to Mississauga in 4 hours? Right. No. Right? So it's obvious that they're not going to come. Right? So one should have, or for instance, that you don't have the money to go. Or you don't have the time to go, or you have something else to do that you're pretty sure if you're not reasonably sure that you could do it, don't promise that you would. Right? Don't promise, right? Especially if you know that you're not going to come. Right? Now, if you are sure that you have the strong intention to come, and this is just one example, right? Say, even in business, right? I'll save this product for you. I'll hold it for you, right? Or I'll bring it to you tomorrow, or these types of promises. Or the painter says, okay, I'll come and finish it tomorrow, right? But outside of the bounds of the contract. This is a promise, right? So if they have the firm resolve to do it, right, and they know that they'll be able to do it, they freed up their schedule, everything is set, the car is packed, everything, the employees, right, his crew is ready, right? But something comes up, someone gets sick, a car accident, someone goes to the hospital and they can't come, right? Then it would not be sinful or disliked if it was something that they couldn't perceive ahead of time. So some circumstance happened, right? But if one does not fulfill it without any excuse, right, then it would be disliked. And if it causes the other person harm, it could be haram. It could be haram. Right. But they say, right, al-udru la yabqa udran idha takarrar. Excuses do not remain if they are repetitive. Right. What's your excuse? Oh, there's traffic. Right. That's why I didn't get to work on time. It's a trust. You're in a contract to be at a job at a certain time every day, and you come an hour late. First day, okay, traffic, new job, you didn't know how the roads were that day. Right, one day. Okay, next day, hour late again. What's your excuse? Traffic. Third day, what's the excuse? Traffic. Fourth day, right? Now, it's not an excuse, right? Right? So an excuse does not remain an excuse if it continues. So a person continuously breaks promises, right? That is one of the major sins. And it's very dangerous because the Prophet ﷺ likened that person to a hypocrite. And the hypocrites in the Quran are generally talked about in two different ways. There's hypocrites in faith. إِذَا جَاءَكَ الْمُنَافِقُونَ قَالُوا نَشْهَدُ أَنَّكَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ. Right? The hypocrites in faith, that they say that they're Muslim, but they're not. But then there's hypocrite in action. Right, those that their actions look like they're pretty much, right, that they're hypocrites, right? Allah says that they only pray reluctantly and lazily. They don't remember Allah except for a little bit. Right? They don't give their money in zakat except if they're forced, right? Or if they're or reluctantly. Right? One of them, the Prophet said that the signs of a hypocrite in action are three. That when they speak, they lie. When they promise, they break their promise. And when they are trusted with something, they betray that trust. So constantly fulfilling and not fulfilling promises is very serious. Right? So you go to a pizza shop, I need 30 pizzas for my party. Right? It's not a business contract until you actually go and you make the transfer of the money and the item. Right? But you call them ahead of time. Right? And you don't show up. Right? That person made 30 pizzas. Right? And they can't just sell it to other people. Right? So that would be haram. You cause them, right, great hardship because of that. So the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "La imana liman la amanata lah." Right? And Sayyidina Anas bin Malik, he actually says that the Prophet never gave a khutbah except that he said in the khutbah that there is no iman for the person who has no trust, or for the person who can't be trusted. Right? And he says, "Wala dina liman la ahda lahu." Right? And there is no religion for the one who does not fulfill their commitments. And it doesn't mean that a person who doesn't fulfill their commitments is a disbeliever, but it means that their faith is not realized. Right? So one, right, it is a responsibility upon especially the Muslim, but anyone who agrees to the terms of a contract, right, or promises something, that they fulfill that trust. Right? So they fulfill the contract and the expectations of that contract to the best of their abilities. Right? And two, that they observe, right, that they do that within the limits, the scope of the job. Right? And three, that they avoid the questionable. Now, one area which is, I would say, not common knowledge is the idea of, right, double dipping. You get hired by a company to do a very specific service, right, only for that company. Right? Now, the basis of a contract as an employee is that you have the best interest of that company in mind. That's part of the contract. That you're working on the best interest of that company. So you're doing your job to the extent to fulfill their goals as a company. Now, for you to go and do that very specific job that you were specifically hired by that company to do for another competitor company is not permissible. Right? You cannot do that, right, without explicit permission from this company. You can't work for their competitor and do the same thing at the same time, just making double money. Right? You can't do that, right, unless it's allowed in the contract terms. Okay, so, but these are, right, on the basis of limits, right? What you can and what you can't do. But the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't do things on the basis of just mere limits. He did everything he did with ihsan, with excellence. Right? So, especially when one is working, right, they should work with excellence. And this is the kind of work that transformed countries, right, and showed the beauty of Islam. Right? And this is the type of work that draws a person closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they're just sitting at a cubicle. Right? That they could be drawing closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at that cubicle than many people can be on the prayer mat. All right? But excellence would entail that there's excellence in the actual work that one's doing. Right? The Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna Allah yuhibbu idha amila abduhu amalan and yutqinahu." That Allah loves it that when their slave does an action, that they do it perfectly, that they perfect it, that they do it excellently. Right? But two, right, going above and beyond in fulfilling one's commitments. Right? So you're hired for a certain task in a company. Right? The company's goal is to spread world peace or to remove poverty in a certain area. Right? Your job limits you. Right? Your job is restricted to 40 hours a week. But you know that if you were to do this one thing off the books, right, off the clock, that you could really realize that goal for your company, right? To go above and beyond, even though you don't have to. When you clocked out, that's it. You don't have to turn around. You don't have to look at anyone. Just walk straight for the door. You could leave, right? But if you could go that extra mile and really help them in fulfilling that purpose, especially if it's a righteous one, that would be ihsan, right? To go above and beyond one's commitments. 3, especially in the workplace, dealing with other people's shortcomings. Right? Sometimes, like, the network of a company may be very, right, large, that you have sub-managers and sub-teams of different projects, right? So you may be working alongside another colleague that you have to wait for them to do their job in order for you to do your job. And it's very common in large companies, right? So they may be a little bit late. So to be forgiving and to be accepting, right, obviously without being unjust to oneself, right, that's ihsan. Right? Also assisting someone, right? Your colleague has difficulty in doing something, right? They're new to the job, or something. To go out of your way to help them, to teach them, to show them, right? To get on that video call and show them how to do the program and how to do this. 5, upholding nasiha. Nasiha means, right, to want the best outcomes for the other and to strive to fulfill that. Right, so you work for an organization, right, to do your best to fulfill their goals, right, even if it means going above and beyond. Right, and lastly, but really definitely the key, is to have high intentions in their work, in one's work. Right, so you see this in the Muslim world and this is one of the blessings of the Muslim world, that even though we have moved into 2020, right, and very close to 2021, that the moral fabric of the business place, of the marketplace in many Muslim countries is still very strong, whereas, right, in many so-called developed countries is non-existent. Right? You bought something, you didn't like it, can I return it? Sorry. Right? We don't have a return policy. That's it. Right? Most Muslim countries, if you did that, they would say sure. They would say no problem. Right? It could part of the problem is that, right, that people are not working for themselves. There's not, right, that people are working for large companies that have, right, very specific rules, so they don't really have the discretion to give you a discount or. Right? But also, so as an entrepreneur, as most Muslim countries, people work for themselves. Right? They have small businesses. They have the freedom to do that, which is one of the blessings of working for yourself. Right? A person came to Imam Ahmed and said that I want to work. And he told him to work for himself, to be an entrepreneur, because maybe there is a sick person or maybe there's a janazah. And that's all he said. Maybe there's a sick person and maybe there's a janazah. Meaning if you work for yourself, right, and something comes up, somebody passed away, you want to go to the funeral, you don't have to ask anyone. You're your own boss. You can go to the funeral, close the shop and go. Right? Or if someone is sick, you want to go visit them, you don't have to ask your boss or file ahead of time for leave and get a note from the doctor. You don't have to do any of that. You can just go. And also, you have the ability to give discounts when people don't have enough, right? To give people refunds or to give extra charity. One of the amazing things of the workplace in Tarim, if you go to buy vegetables, it's like an amazing sight. I went to buy a watermelon once. In Tarim they call watermelon habhab, because it has a lot of seeds. And so not only did they first pointed out what they thought to be the sweetest watermelon possible for me to buy, before myself even asking, right? And then he said, "Okay, are you sure you want this one?" Right? And he's concerned that I was the one who chose it, not because of because he doesn't really have. There's no certainty that this is the sweetest one. It's kind of hit or miss. You have signs, but you can try your best, but it's hit or miss. So he said, you know what? And he cut the whole thing in half, and he gave me, I took a spoon and cut it, and gave me a taste. Do you like it? And it wasn't sweet at all. Right? And he tasted himself, like a tiny bit. It's not sweet. Next. And it's already open. Like, who's going to buy? And you're not going to really be able to sell that as easily as you would something that wasn't. And he did it again. Right? And until I got the one that I liked the best, right? And this is just prophetic character. Right? Right? And then, but we kind of look down on it because it doesn't have like the formalities of our business experience, our purchasing experience. Because there's not really much of a line. You kind of have to yell, right, in order to get heard. You have to kind of wave money in someone's face in order for them to be like, okay, what do you want? Like my secret in Arab countries, I give the money first. Because once they have the money, they have to listen to you. Because they won't just take your money. I remember in Medina, I'm literally standing like 10 minutes in this line. I was first, and I still don't have anything in my hand. And people have gone, taken their shawarmas and left in Medina. Right down the street from the masjid. So I'm like I'm not going to get anything to eat if I just continue this like passive Westerner, like waiting in line method. Right? I'm going to be starving if I don't, right? So I just went to the front and I went like this. I just put money in his face. Right? So he took it, Ishmak, what do you want? Right? Then I told him what I want, now he has to give it to me. So, right? Even though it doesn't look the nicest, but they are beautiful people, and they uphold these. And to the extent that we can uphold these in our businesses and in our societies, right? Right? Beauty is manifest, and beauty doesn't need explanation. It doesn't need words. People see beauty and they notice it. Right? Non-Muslims, in that experience, they would appreciate that greatly and ascribe it immediately to Islam. Right? And then the basics of upholding good character in work, we kind of mentioned that already, especially in one's correspondence with other people, right? Instead of saying, did you do this task? It's kind of rude, straight to the point, really right? Inhumane type of right? discourse. Instead of saying, Assalamu alaikum, right? How are you, how's everything? Have you been able to do this task? Right? And having nice words. Generally, in our cultures, we have that. We have like right, sincerely and dear and right, thank you. But sometimes no. Right? And these are important things not to lose. And a lot of the moral fabric of the world is being lost every single day. And the more that we can hold on and preserve, the better. There's a very beautiful verse in the Quran, or Allah in Surah, I believe in Surah Isra, if I'm not mistaken, where Allah talks about people, right, true believers, لا تلهيهم تجارة ولا بيع عن ذكر الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة يخافون يوما تتقلب فيه القلوب والأبصار. That true believers whose trade and transaction, their business or their work, right, does not busy them from the remembrance of Allah. It doesn't distract them from Allah. Right? And it doesn't distract them from establishing the prayer. And it doesn't distract them from giving the zakat. They are in awe of a day when the hearts and the sights are overturned, meaning the day of judgment. That they live for the next life. Now, not being distracted in work, depending on the job, can be difficult. Right, the bare minimum is that right, the prayer supersedes everything. Right? The prayer is the most important. We already mentioned the hadith. The Prophet said seeking a lawful means is obligatory after the obligations. Right, so prayer is first. Second to that is the job. And generally the Sahaba in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, they would work between the time of Ishraq. Right? They would pray their duha prayer. Right? They would work up until just before dhuhr. So there really is no sunnah prayers or any type of worship that's specific to that time, right? In that time. And then after that, they would just spend the rest of the day with Allah, right? In their prayers and in their, right, with their families and such. Right? So they would make all of their work at that time, which is, many places still do that. They would probably add Asr to just before Maghrib as well. Some countries, they really hold on to these things. Like in Tarim, if you want to buy something between Maghrib and Isha, good luck. Good luck. Everyone's in the masjid. Everyone and their grandfather. Everyone's in the masjid. Right? Even the taxi drivers, all the cars are just parked and empty. Everyone is in the masjid reciting the Quran. Right? And that's the tradition there, because between Maghrib and Isha is a very blessed time, right? Especially for Quran. Right? So to not be distracted in the world, right? In work, right? In essence, what we don't want to do is to squeeze into the worship into the day. We don't just squeeze it in when we get a few minutes, just quickly pray Dhuhr and go back. Right? We don't want to do that. Right? We want, to the extent that we can, to pray Dhuhr properly, with presence of heart. Right? And the reason we're talking about Dhuhr, because generally people don't, right, pray tahajjud at work. Right, so the job itself should not crowd out our worship, right? Because that's just loss. Right? We were created for Allah, not for, right, money. And the money is promised. And a lot of the problems that people have, right, in balancing this is due to a lack of certainty in that fact. It's promised. Right? وَإِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَا يَمُوتُ إِنَّ النَّفْسَ لَن تَمُوتَ حَتَّى تَسْتَكْمِلَ رِزْقَهَا. No soul will die until they have completely taken all of their provision. Everything is written. Every grain of rice, every sip of water that you will ever drink, right, from the time that you are born till the time that you die, right, is already determined before Allah even created us. Before Allah even created our bodies. Right? Every single penny. You will not get any more, you will not get any less. It will never decrease, it will never increase, no matter what you do. So somebody says, so does that mean that we just stay in the masjid and just say Allah, 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 and Allah is just going to provide us? No. Right? The etiquette of the slave with Allah is to seek the means. And the Prophet said, seeking the means, Allah, lawful means, halal. But if a person did do that, they would still get the exact same thing that Allah wrote for them. Right? So it's a big difference. Right? It's a difference in perception, because Allah promised it. It's not even like an ambiguous verse. It's a promise from Allah. وَعَلَى اللَّهِ رِزْقُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ. I don't recall the exact verse at the moment, right? But it's a promise. Right? So preferring worship of Allah, right, should be natural to the person who has certainty in that fact. Right? Seeking the means should be filled in between that. Right? But at the very least, right, the work should not stop us from fulfilling our religious obligations, like salat, jumu'ah. Right? To pray the Dhuhr prayer, right, with all of the sunnah and to do it properly, it shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. Right? Unless you read really slow. You don't have to read Baqarah at work. It's not piety to make things hard on yourself. Right? But at the least, to pray. In most places, if you're respectful, if you do your job well, if you're not lazy and show up late all the time, right? If a person does their job well and they ask for an opportunity to pray, right, generally that is met with great welcoming and, right, respect. Right? You don't even have to ask. You don't have to ask. Do people ask to go to the bathroom at most jobs? Not really. Right? You could go. People take cigarette breaks and it's just customarily, no, you want to go and pray to Allah for 5 minutes. You don't really have to ask. Right? But if it could be agreed upon ahead of time, then it makes it a lot easier. You don't have to like sneak around. Where is he at? Oh, he's in the stairwell or something praying. Right? but you don't really have to ask. Now, Jumu'ah is something that workplaces should figure out, especially if there's a large Muslim presence in the workplace. They should all get together and go to the boss and say that, look, we have to pray. Even if they take the Hanafi opinion and do the prayer in, do a small congregation of their own, then that would suffice as well. But besides the prayer, right, to constantly be in a state of dhikr, remembrance of Allah, right, to stay in wudu, to have wudu during the work, right, to pray in congregation if one can. If there's a lot of Muslims in one place, right, especially if you're going to the tech field or the science field, you probably have so many Muslims. Right. Almost, I would say 90% of the people that I've met that are in college and Muslim, right, are either going to be a doctor or an engineer. Right? And if the Muslims just didn't want to work anymore, they just gave up, I don't want to work anymore, right, the world would collapse because we wouldn't have any doctors or engineers left. So if there's a large Muslim presence, then it wouldn't be far-fetched for them to pray together. It shouldn't be difficult. Not that you're going to call the adhan like Al-Azhar adhan, like 15 minutes long adhan with, right, on the loudspeaker at work. It doesn't mean you have to do that, but nor do you have to make a mihrab out of your cubicle, right? But you can have a small meeting room or something. So lastly, the money that one earns, right, is really important to, right, know that money is a means, it's not a goal. Right? Money, first of all, it's already promised. So seeking it at the risk of one's akhirah is foolishness to the fullest extent. Right? Because Jannah is not promised. Right? So, as they say, to seek that which is promised, right, to give up that which is not promised for the sake of that which is already promised is foolishness. Right? But the money is a means, it's not a goal. It's not a point of status, it's not a point of comparison to others, it's not at any point of superiority over others that you have more money, therefore you're better in the sight of Allah. It doesn't mean anything. Fir'aun had all the money, right? Allah says he's fasideen, he's corrupt. The Prophet, right, many of the Prophets completely poor, right? And many times voluntarily poor, right? And Allah loved them more than all of creation, right? So the money is the means, right? So one should spend and save with high intentions. Even if you're going to save with high intentions, right? So taking care of one's family is an act of worship. Saving money, the Prophet said, al-iqtisadu fi an-nafq nisf al-ma'isha. Moderation and spending is half of livelihood. Right? To budget one's spending, save money ahead of time. Right? One should be grateful for that money. We talked about some of these in the beginning. Right? And then one should spend according to priorities. Right? Clear priorities, first and foremost, is obligations. Right. Zakat, taking care of the family, taking care of the children's education falls under that, the family, right? The well-being of the family, the bills, all of these things are obligations. So generally the scholars break things down into three categories. There's the daruriyats, there's the necessities of life, that which you can't survive without. You can't survive without having food, without having a basic shelter, especially in Canada in the winter. Right? And you can't survive without, right, basic drink or whatever, right? And these things. Right? Then second level would be needs, that they preserve the good and they prevent the harm, but you could technically live without it. Right? Like, for instance, electricity. People have been living for thousands and thousands of years without electricity, right? But would life be very difficult without it? Yes. And I think one of the greatest experiences, if anyone has not experienced it ever, is being 12 hours in the middle of the desert with no electricity whatsoever until you're just literally just melting away, and then the electricity comes back on and the fan starts moving. It's literally like the greatest shukr of the heart. Like, I think people just become like raising in ranks with Allah when that fan comes on because of their gratitude. But could you live without electricity? Technically, yeah. It's not a daruri, it's not a necessity of life, that life does not exist without it, but it is a need. And so that would be the second priority. And then the thirds are wants. Everything else is just wants. And we should be very specific in our terms. Like, oh, I want those headphones. Right? You should say I want instead of, oh, I really need those headphones. Right? I gotta have that car. Right? No, you don't. Right? You want the car. You would like the car. We should be very specific in our terms. And I think Arab and the Arabic language specifically has a one up on us for that, because they don't play with terms. Arabs are very specific. They would never say, I love chocolate. No matter what, or how much they liked it. They would say, ashtahi, right? Yu'jibuni, I like it, it's good. But they would never use love for something worldly. Right? Same thing, they would never say, I need that car. At least they wouldn't in the past. Tamam. So clearly spending on propriety. So if someone buys a want and neglects a need, that could be sinful, especially if it affects other people. Right? Somebody splurges on some unnecessary item while the family are left without food and shelter, and or even the electricity bill wasn't paid, but we got a buffet dinner from so-and-so kebab, right? You don't need a buffet dinner. Right? Pay the electricity bill, make some sandwiches, and say Bismillah. Priorities. So, but above and beyond necessities and needs and the like, right? But spending on the good, being charitable, is a very important part of our deen. Right? And Allah equates giving, in Arabic language, the word for spending, nafaqah or infaq, right, has a direct correlation to the word nifaq, hypocrisy, because one of the main ways to tell the true claim of belief in Allah on the next day, and the last day, and a weakness in that claim is money. Where people put their money. Someone can say all day long that about the akhirah, but when it comes to give, it's very difficult. Right? And that was one of the qualities of the hypocrites, that they did not spend on any of their money unless they had to, unless it was either spend or confess that we're hypocrites. That was their. They would, in that case, they would spend, but reluctantly, and they would only join battles, for the sake of the war spoils. Right? And they would just hide and dodge people and just hide in a corner until it's over, and then they get all the. Right? The Prophet dealt with them according to the outward. Right? But those who spent for the sake of Allah, those who help people, one of the greatest good deeds of all is to give charity. Right? A sadaqah, and the word sadaqah is a beautiful word. It comes from the word siddiq, truthfulness. And the word zakat is another beautiful word, because zakat means purification, and it also means numu, growing, spiritual growth as well. And so the minimum is zakat, that's obligatory, but beyond that is charitable. Right? But being very specific in making that charity the most benefit possible, because you could give a person. Right? Or you could give to an organization that takes care of 1,000 people. Right? You could, to focus your money on that which is most beneficial for the ummah and most pleasing to Allah is best. Right? And if it entails another good deed on top of that, like helping out a relative or helping out a neighbor, then it's even more multiplied. Right? And Allah says, and we'll close with this, وَابْتَغِي فِي مَا آتَاكَ اللَّهُ دَارَ الْآخِرَةِ. Take that which Allah has given you and seek the next life by it. Right? Seek from that which Allah has given you the final abode, right, the hereafter. All right, so that's what we wanted to cover. We kind of went a bit long in the introduction and a few of the topics. But if there's any questions, we can take them. Preferably specific to the financial aspect, but all questions are welcomed.
There are a lot of questions.
Oh boy.
Online.
Bismillah.
It says which
Let's put 10 minutes for questions. I'll try to be brief and do as many as we can.
Okay.
Inshallah.
It says which book are you reading from? Is it Minhaj?
There's no specific book. This is based on a section of Islamic jurisprudence called Al-Hadar wal-Ibaha, technically, literally translated Halal and Haram. Right? I don't know of any specific English translations of such a chapter, but usually the chapters that are translated are the chapters of worship. So there may be, but I'm not sure.
Is multi-level marketing close to haram?
Is multi-level marketing close to haram? And generally, any type of marketing or advertising would be have the same ruling of what you're advertising. So if you're advertising a haram thing, then it would be haram. If you're advertising in a deceptive way, then that would be also wrong and sinful. Right? But otherwise, then generally it's just mere advertising, and people advertised all throughout history. There's people that fabricated hadith in order to sell their products. Haram, completely haram. The Prophet said, "Whoever lies intentionally against me, then let them set up their place in the hellfire." There's a hadith about the guy who sells eggplants, that he would say that the Prophet said this about eggplants and the benefits of eggplants, but there's no hadith about eggplants. Go ahead.
This person has two questions. How do I know I'm doing enough to please Allah in my daily job? I have doubts sometimes when I do my work calmly because I don't like to stress myself and have tawakkul in Him. One more question. I used to recite Yasin every morning and do some dhikr, but since I started working, I couldn't do it all, especially Yasin. Should I use the time at work to recite for 15 minutes?
MashaAllah.
Same person.
Regarding the first question, if there's any specific issues that the person is having difficulties in, they should consult a scholar about the specifics. But in general, one should have diligence in fulfilling the terms of their agreement with their employer. Right? So to have concern to fulfill it in an excellent way, but at the same time, trusting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not trusting in the means. During the work, they should try to keep a sibha or a prayer, dhikr beads, or some sort of counter, if they can, with their hands, right? To try to remember Allah, but it should not affect their work quality. Right? So the work is worship. The work is worship, and I believe we did a seminar. It's recorded on the Seekers website called "Work as Worship," and I would say that this person should watch that. It might benefit. The second question about the Yasin, you can try to do it on your way to work. Right? If you're allowed 15-minute break at work or something like that, if it's during a break or if it's during a time where it's customarily that you're not specifically required at that moment to be doing something, then you can read it as you wish. Right? You can read it on your commute. But the fact that you're regretful that you can't read it, that's the most important thing. That is the most important. Even if you did have to work and you couldn't have time to read it, the fact that you regretted not being able to read it, that is a sign of a good heart. Right? It's the person that's searching for concessions, right, and searching for an opportunity that, no, I don't have to read it because I'm a traveler or because I'm like this or that. That's a bad sign. Allahu Alam.
Exaggerating profit margins far above market price range.
Yeah, so lying, right, deception, all of these things are impermissible, right? Especially if people are trusting in that, in your critique or in your analysis, right, and they're basing their decisions on your deceptive things, then that's haram. Right? It's impermissible. So, anyone here have questions? MashaAllah. I'm not the financial specialist. Right? Any specific questions can be directed to the people of knowledge, like Shaykh Faraz and others. But generally, the Prophet said that sin is that which bothers your heart. Right? And if the heart is pure enough, they will automatically, right, detect, right, the wrong nature of certain actions. Right? And the Prophet said, "Istafti qalbak," ask your heart. But that's on the condition that your heart is sound, that your care and concern is Allah and His Messenger. Right? Ask your heart. In أَفْتَاكَ النَّاسُ وَأَفْتَوْكَ وَأَفْتَوْكَ. Even if people give you fatwa after fatwa after fatwa, they say it's permissible, so and so said it's permissible. What does your heart say? You still have that anxiety or that grief in it. It's most likely something wrong. Right? Stay away from it. But consult. Right? Don't just go, right, rogue in religious matters. So we'll end there, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.